This week on the agenda, Iran and the green transition. Is the conflict in the Middle East finally marking the end of the world's reliance on fossil fuels? US-Israeli strikes on Iran and the resulting blockade of the Strait of Hormuz have once again exposed the world's deep dependence on oil and gas. Some argue this could be the tipping point that finally accelerates the shift to renewable energy. Others point out that turmoil in the Middle East is driving up costs for solar, for wind, making things harder, not easier. So what does this crisis really mean for the future of the green transition? With me now are Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission, Mann, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs, and Ramon Mendez, former Energy Secretary of Uruguay. Great to have all of you on the agenda. Lord Turner, let me start with you, because we've been here before. You know, crisis hits, everyone talks about clean energy. You know, why should this time be any different?
Well, you're absolutely right. Just 4 years ago, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we were talking about a huge energy crisis here in Europe and the fact that it would accelerate progress towards renewables. Now, it's important to note that it did accelerate progress towards renewables. Europe has made much more progress over the last 4 years than it was previously on. But I think even compared with this, I anticipate that this will have a much more powerful effect on accelerating the energy transition than previous shocks. And the reason why I believe that is that the costs of some crucial technologies have fallen so much, even in the last 4 or 5 years, that they are now economic. We passed about 2 years ago in China the point where EVs were cheaper to buy upfront than equivalent internal combustion engine vehicles. We've just passed that point in the UK as well. So now it's not a problem of I have to buy a more expensive EV in order to enjoy the benefit of lower operating costs. It's cheaper up front. And we've also seen, I think hugely important, over the last 4 years, an extraordinarily dramatic fall in the cost of storage batteries. Storage batteries have come down in cost by 60 or 70%. Couple them with solar, and I think solar plus batteries is now a solution which is economic as a source of energy in many parts of the world. So it's that cost collapse that makes me confident that this will be even more accelerating of the trend than we've seen in the past.
Marjorie, what about you? Are you as confident as Adair there? Because in the middle of the crisis, some would say the world is becoming more reliant on fossil fuels rather than less.
Yeah, in some way, the current crisis in the Middle East is pushing the global energy transition into opposing directions at the same time. In the immediate term, the world, particularly Asian countries that rely heavily on imported LNG from the Middle East, is leaning harder on coal and scramble for whatever oil they can get. However, the crisis is simultaneously proving that reliance on imported fossil fuel is a massive security vulnerability. Clearly, countries with strong renewable infrastructure or electric vehicle adoption are finding themselves more resilient, as Lord Turner noted. The crisis is viewed as, in China, almost like a vindication of a strategic national decision to expand renewable energy and to electrify our economy. If our memory is not too short, then the crisis is expected to supercharge the strategic push toward renewable energy over the long run.
Ramon, I see you nodding away there. I mean, do you think then we are underestimating how quickly renewables can respond to a shock like this?
Yes, perhaps, because in fact, today, I absolutely agree. Today, the driver for the transition is no longer climate change, is already the economy. The economy is the cost reduction, the stabilization of costs. Take, for example, what happened in my country. We succeeded to have 98% of our electricity coming from renewable sources. So we are absolutely independent of those crazy variations managed due to the geopolitical events. So it's no longer decreasing cost. It's also stabilizing cost. and having stability in the energy sector. So the driver today is absolutely clear. But in fact, all our system has been built according to the characteristic of fossil fuels. So the regulation, market design, even institutional framework has been defined according to different characteristics of what you're doing today. So it's not just changing one fuel to another fuel. It's just redefining the power system. And this is, of course, it takes a little more time. But today, the most important point is the battle considering the narrative. We have a narrative that needs to be shifted. And what is going on today in the Middle East is certainly a huge help in order to go to this narrative shift.
You talk about that narrative shift, but Lord Adair, there is these economic forces which are really driving the conversation, and it's a bit of a paradox. Higher oil prices should boost renewable, but higher interest rates make it harder to build all of that and the infrastructure around them. So, is this crisis helping or hurting the transition?
Well, you're absolutely right that the impact of higher interest rates can be bad for the transition because it is structurally a characteristic of our future deeply electrified renewable economy that it has very, very low operating costs, almost zero marginal cost of operation, but all the costs are upfront. But that means that the cost of capital for that upfront investment is very important. And we've seen this in the UK. We had a significant increase in interest rates between 2020 and 2024, and the cost of offshore wind at our auctions actually went up, having been on a strong downward path for the last 15 years. So there is that challenge, but I think the cost of the equipment is now getting so cheap that it'll overweigh that. And we should think about ways to offset that interest rate effect. For instance, that interest rate effect will make still more some of the challenges of emerging markets which have a structurally high cost of capital. But we have the ability through, for instance, multilateral development banks to reduce the cost of capital. And I think what we sit on now is a huge opportunity across the world to couple the fact that there is spare capacity in China on many of the crucial technologies, on solar PV, on batteries and EVs. There is huge opportunity to drive the transition, for instance, in Africa, which I think has an extraordinary opportunity for solar plus batteries to be deployed. And we need to work together to use the development banks and other institutions to try to unleash the low-cost capital which can enable them to seize that opportunity. So, yes, it is a challenge. It's offset by falling costs, but we also need to work out what are the policy responses which keep the cost of capital as low as possible.
So, Marjorie, what do you think can be done to address that challenge, that renewables are cheap to run but expensive to build?
As noted, the high upfront capital cost, the capex, is a major challenge, and that make renewable project like wind and solar highly sensitive to borrowing costs, and high interest rate disproportionately penalize wind and solar compared to fossil fuel, and we need to pay special attention to the emerging market countries and the developing countries because they often struggle to secure the massive initial loans required for green infrastructure, as noted. So it is often financially easier for them to get loans to build a cheap coal or gas plant, even if importing the fuel costs much more in the long run. So as Lord Turner pointed out, that we need to find ways not just to reduce the cost of all the renewable products, but also try to create financial mechanism, to help, particularly help those least developed countries.
Listening to all of you, you're very, very much team renewables. But, Ramon, if they are so resilient, why do countries keep falling back on fossil fuels the moment there's a shock? I'm thinking about Germany in particular, who's even considering slowing its coal phase out.
Well, because in fact, as I said before, we need to change the system, not just to think that we are going to go from one fuel to another.
Yeah.
And precisely with what my colleagues were talking about, we need to reframe the market design. We are the usual thing is just to compete in a spot market. But now with renewables, we are no longer in an industry sector, but we're in a financial business because everything is just paying back the investment. And so capital cost is almost everything, is these new systems. So reducing the risk perception by investor is the most important issue. In Uruguay, for example, we went from the traditional spot market to a long-term capacity market. 100% of our demand is under long-term contracts. So the investors competed not in the market, but competed for the market. And so this brings us incredible stability for both investors and the demand and consumers. And so this is a kind of dramatic shift that we need to make in the way we remunerate investment and the way we define the market. This is not understood everywhere. I mean, we are just beginning this discussion. Yeah. And so that's why in the large majority of countries that we know, we are still continuing with the same market design that was very useful for the past, but not for the future.
The immediate response to higher gas prices can be to say, I'm going to run my coal where I've got coal a bit more because that's what the economic push is to me, or I'm short of actual physical gas supply. And we are seeing that in India, we are seeing that in China, we will maybe see a bit of that in Europe. But I think we need to make sure that we combine what is a very short-term rebalancing effect with reinforcing the policies to move beyond fossil fuels entirely and to move fully to renewable and clean sources. And one of the things that we need to do in that is to carefully design any subsidy or immediately response actions. So there are across the countries of the world, and it's particularly extreme actually in South and Southeast Asia, real pressures hitting, individual consumers because of, for instance, shortages of LPG gas for cooking, shortages of diesel, etc. And there will be a tendency for countries, if they can afford it, to try to do subsidy regimes or things like that. And you can't avoid some of those. But it's very important that any subsidy regime or price cap has, I think, three features. One, it must not completely offset for the consumer the rise in the cost which is being driven by the market. It's very important that they see a significant part of the price signal, even if you protect them against the biggest extreme. Two, you should focus any subsidies or fiscal support as much as possible on low-income people rather than giving it to the generality of people. And third, any subsidy regime has to be temporary and not end up as a permanent feature. And if you do that, we can manage some of the short-term social implications of this for relatively low-income people, while still allowing the market of consumers and industry to understand that there's a price signal here which is telling them that exposure to fossil fuels is exposure to volatility, and they want to move beyond that.
Marjorie, let's talk about the shift that we're seeing in the global energy system, because if this crisis is accelerating clean energy and China is driving much of the global manufacturing and deployment, does that change the balance of the global energy system?
No, I don't think in the short term, but over the long run, that may represent a fundamental shift from the petrol state world to a electro state world. China is electrifying its economy 9 times faster than the rest of the world. So it is dubbed as one of the first major electro states in the world. While China continues to make investment on clean tech R&D and supply chain continue to grow, along with the vast expansion of domestic deployment of solar, wind, EVs, and batteries. And while in the same time, some other countries who used to have that very high capacity choose to give up their own competing ability, the global balance of power may really shift. I put it as a big if. So the Middle East crisis is hastening the end of the oil era. We do see many Chinese companies understand their strength, but also their weakness. They understand that they need to overcome strong resistance globally. And so I don't see them seek to dominate as coming from the so-called undisputed superpower of the new global energy system. And they're looking for ways to cooperate. So I really think our planet and mankind will all be better off if we can promote that kind of collaborations.
Ramon, Uruguay moved faster than almost any other country on renewables. What made that possible? And what can the rest of the world learn from Uruguay?
Well, perhaps the most important point is that we understood as a political system that this was the best for our own interest. Once again, we put the interest of the transition not only in climate change or contributing to stopping climate change, but in the real benefits for our country. With the transition help us to reduce by a factor of 2 the cost of producing electricity, abandoning fossil fuels and going to our own renewable sources. We stabilized costs, we created 50,000 new jobs, which was something like 3% of the total labor force of the country. So in fact, we had a tremendous agreement between all political parties. We had a long-term policy that was backed by the entire Uruguayan political system. That's why for 4 consecutive governments, going from left to right and right to left, and we continue exactly with the same policy because all political system understood that this was the best for our interest. So we shifted the narrative, understanding that this is really, the future is already here and the benefits are very, very clear. So this was absolutely crucial. But once again, the second and very most important issue is that transition is not going to happen spontaneously, even if today is the cheapest option, because the rules of the game has been defined for other kind of technologies. So technology is ready, everything is ready, costs are ready, the new system is mature enough in order to deliver, but the market by itself cannot make it. We need to change the rules, we need to impose new expanding regulation, new operation regulation, new market design, and everything need to be put in place in order for renewables to express all the possibilities or the capabilities. This is something that we are now trying to share with the rest of the world, how much the change is needed in order to make the transition possible.
There's lots of pieces of the puzzle you mentioned that need to all fit together. I mean, Marjon, what do you think matters the most if you want to move fast? Is it politics? Is it economics? Is it institutions?
All 3 are essential. As Mr. Gallen noted, institutions, I believe, matter most for dictating the speed. And of course, political will is required to set ambitious targets and initiate all this transition. Without that, we can't really move forward. And economics, as noted, attracts private capital, but the wind and solar are already the cheapest forms of new energy in many parts of the world. So pure economics is less a barrier than it used to be. So institution is ultimate bottleneck for many regions to move more fast. You can have immense political will and endless capital, but if you regulatory institutions require many years to approve permits or conduct, or grant great interconnected connections. Rapid deployment is also quite difficult. So in short, if a country wants to move maximum speed, they need to have efficient institution capable of cutting red tape, and of course, to ensure that we can do a high quality environmental review and permitting, and in a sustainable way, in a fair way, and we need also innovative solutions to achieve that.
And so, Lord Turner, when there's a shock like this, when the energy chain comes under pressure, what do you think is the bit that's going to fail first or going to break? Is it political decision-making, the financing, or the physical infrastructure?
Well, I think each crisis is a bit different. And if you think about this crisis, it's quite interesting that if you talk about actual physical effects, not really on infrastructure, but shortages, they are highly regionally concentrated. And here in Europe, there's no shortage of an ability to buy, diesel or petrol. But in India, there are actual shortages of, physical shortages. And there are some countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia talking about having to introduce forms of rationing because there are actual physical limits. It also, by the way, varies by individual product. One of the things to realize about this particular impact on the Strait of Hormuz is that it has produced some severe limitations on some things that I certainly didn't know about. I didn't know that a hell of a lot of the world's helium comes from the Gulf, sulfur for sulfuric acid, and phosphate for fertilizers. So you're seeing these very, very concentrated effects. And I think what is going to come out of that is people saying, well, we want to escape from that in future. We want more diverse supplies. We don't want to be so dependent on particular parts of the world. The financing impact takes longer because, people have already got projects in place which have negotiated, deals with banks. When the interest rates goes up, we'll see how it flows through the system. And they will be dependent on how long this challenge, how long the situation actually lasts. So it's a variety of different things. And one of the most important things for politicians is to try to respond to the immediate, focused problems which are producing severe problems for particular supply chains or particular groups of consumers, while not overreacting and indeed reinforcing the progress towards the energy transition, which will enable us to create a system which is more resilient against these shocks in future.
Ramon, I wonder where you think this crisis leaves the green transition, the big picture. Is it more resilient or is it more exposed?
For sure, the new system, the new renewable-based economy is much more resilient than the traditional fossil fuel-based one. I mean, this is no doubt about it. The technology is ready. Everything is ready. We just have to manage the system in a completely different way. But everything is ready. It's just political decision and understanding that we need to change the rules of the game, once again, in order to make it possible. But, and this is something which is important that we don't have to forget about it. We have, in the past, we used to have huge subsidies in order to put in place the new renewable-based economy. But today is exactly the opposite. Today we have $1.4 trillion subsidies to fossil fuel industry. And this is not my figures, this is not International Renewable Energy figures, this is the IMF numbers. The IMF is very worried about the high subsidies which are receiving the fossil fuel industry in order to continue with this business all over the world. So once again, we need to put the new technology with the old technology in the same footing in order to compete in the same footing. And when this happens, believe me, this was our case in Uruguay. Renewables are the winner. Let's take, for example, my case. We in a way, we are already an electro state. I'm using 98% renewable electricity at home and in office. I heat my house and office with air conditioning using 98% renewable electricity. I run my car. I pay $4 to make 500 kilometers with my EV. So the new economy is better than the old one, but we need to set the scene for this to happen.
What could determine whether this transition can keep pace with shocks like we're seeing?
There are several factors that determine the pace of transition under the shock conditions. And the most straightforward one is if the country is running cars on gasoline, they're going to remain chained to the Strait of Hormuz for many years to come. But a country running their transport on domestically generated electricity, of course, it's structured immune to some of the tanker disruptions. And then behind that, I think there are also this ability to integrate, expand, not just expand the capacity of the renewable, but also the ability to absorb them into the grid. Nations with high battery storage and fast ramping gas or coal peakers, whether the price specs better, and those with AI technology that can predict, make accurate long-term weather forecast, predictions, and coordinate supply and demand will do better. And last but not least, if the country controls its own supply chain, then of course it has all the flexibilities. But if not, those who can build trust with reliable regional or global supplier can also accelerate deployment under this crisis pressure when they feel needed.
Lord Turner, this week the European Commissioner for Energy, Dan Jorgensen, said something I think this whole panel will chime in with. Now it's more obvious than ever. Clean energy means security, it means affordability, it means independence. If that's the case, though, what's the hold-up?
Well, I think until 10 years ago, and Mr. Mendez already mentioned it, solar wasn't cheaper than fossil fuels. I mean, solar has come down in cost, 90% in the last 10 years, and it's gone from being something where we knew it was a future technology and we needed to subsidize it to one where it is completely, cost effective. So in the past, we had fossil fuel lobbies and they were able to say, well, why are you providing these subsidies? But, we've moved beyond that. We have a set of technologies now which can give us greater energy security. I think Uruguay has made huge progress in that direction. And I think what you have now is countries around the world basically looking at this crisis and saying, as long as I'm exposed to the price of gas, and in particular to the price of LNG, rather than domestic or piped gas, I am exposed to an incredibly volatile commodity on the world basis. As long as I'm a big importer of oil, I'm exposed to that oil price. And I think what we will have is countries around the world saying, no, this is a stimulus to move beyond that. And I know that, for instance, the Indian government is taking that as a very strong message that they have to move beyond these large fossil fuel import bills. And I think you'll see that everywhere. So I think that message that the only way to get to real energy security is to be largely independent in your energy supply. And the best way to do that is to build it primarily on renewables, because it's just a fact that although renewables are not equally distributed across the world, they're much more equally distributed than fossil fuels, which are placed in by unlucky circumstance in some very particular parts of the world, susceptible to some very particular choke points. So I do think the message that the only way to get to energy security is to reinforce two trends: electrification, electrify, and decarbonize your electricity system primarily with renewables. I think that will be very, very strongly reinforced by this current crisis.
Lord Adair Turner, Mann, Ramon, Mendez, thank you all very much.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, is the conflict in Iran driving de-dollarization? And what does that really mean for the global economy? But for now, from me, Juliet, Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.